Today I'm going to give you guys a review of Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny. This is the fifth film released in the Indiana Jones series, and probably the last one we're ever going to get. They may try to reboot it at some point with a different actor, but as far as Harrison Ford is concerned, this is probably his last adventure as the titular hero. So without further ado, I figured I'd give you guys my opinion on the film. The film actually begins in 1944 with a digitally de-aged Harrison Ford who is trying to stop a Nazi from stealing precious artifacts, including the Dial of Destiny. The Nazi in question is also the villain of the film, Jürgen Voland, sorry for my mispronunciation of that, played by Mads Mikkelsen. Indiana Jones successfully stops the Nazis from stealing the artifacts with the help of his friend, and then we jump to 1969, where a much older Indiana Jones is on the verge of retiring. His wife has left him, and he's pretty much all alone. He's still Indiana Jones, and he's just more grouchy and weary in the ways of the world. All in all, it's an interesting look at the character, and it was something I was worried about, but it actually does work in the film. He runs into his goddaughter, Helena, who he calls Wombat. She's played by Phoebe Waller-Bridge, and she's kind of an interesting addition to the series. I heard a lot of reports that she was kind of an annoying character and kind of stole the spotlight from Indy, but that's just not the case. She's definitely capable and is something of a scoundrel, but all in all, I really had no problem with her character, and she's a decent addition to the film. Her father was the man helping Indy at the beginning of the film, and she's going after the Dial of Destiny, which was the artifact that Indy and him were protecting at the beginning of the film, and they must get it before the Nazis get it, because Mads Mikkelsen's character, Voller, is still alive, and he wants to use it to go back in time and stop the Americans from winning the war so the Nazis can win. It's an interesting plot overall, and that's the general premise. So what did I think about the film? Well, let's start with the positives. First and foremost, Harrison Ford is great as Indiana Jones, once again. He's older this time around, even older than he was in Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, obviously, but he really does still have it. He's not as gung-ho and action-centric as this time around, because the man he's 80 now, and he was in his late 70s when they filmed this movie. They work around that in an interesting way. He's much more brutal than he was in the fourth film, which I love. You actually see him actually shoot a few people with guns, because, he can't really be punching a lot of people, so he just whips out the gun and starts blasting. He does use the whip a few times, but he doesn't swing across anything on the whip, which was a little disappointed by. I wanted to see him do that at least once. But all in all, Harrison Ford really does bring it here. It's kind of a look at, the passage of time and the loss of loved ones and friends, and how when you get older, those around you aren't always going to be there. And that's kind of is looked at in an interesting way in this film. I also thought that the action of the film was pretty top-notch. It starts off in the 1940s with a really badass action sequence with a digitally de-aged Harrison Ford. Pretty sure that it was a stuntman doing most of the work, and they just put Ford's face on the man. But it's a really good effect, and though it can be a little wonky, it's an interesting sequence through and through. I also enjoy the score this time around. John Williams came back to do the score for this film, and if I'm not mistaken, I think this is his last score that he's going to do for a major motion picture, because the man is 90. Another positive was the villain, played by Mads Mikkelsen. He is intimidating, and he does kill quite a few people in the movie, and he's not messing around. Side characters are pretty decent as well. We get to see Sallah again in Raiders of the Lost Ark, who's played by John Rhys-Davies, and he has a couple of scenes in the film, and it's great to see him again. All the other side characters in the film are pretty decent as well. Phoebe Waller-Bridge is actually not bad as Wombat, and she has like a sidekick character who's also decent as well. It's kind of like he's kind of reminiscent of Short Round from Temple of Doom, but he's kind of his own character. I didn't love the character, but it is okay to have a sidekick in there, and he doesn't really get in the way or ruin the plot in any sort of way. I also found the artifact and the overall guffin of the film to be way more interesting than Temple of Doom or Kingdom of the Crystal Skull. And probably not up to the degree of Raiders or Last Crusade, but I really did like the Dial and what it did. And another aspect of the film that I really love is the third act. It builds up in a crazy way, and I won't give it away in the main part here, but just know that the final act of this movie is over the top and insane, and it's just really entertaining. Overall, it's a fun adventure, and I did like the story through and through. It does have some sadder moments that actually kind of hit you in the feels, and it also has, like I said, good action, good score, pretty decent pacing. It's a longer movie, and they probably could have trimmed a little bit of time off of it, but it works pretty well. Overall, the performances are really good, too. No one in this film gives a bad performance, and that's true of Harrison Ford, Phoebe Waller-Bridge, Mads Mikkelsen. Everyone's firing on all cylinders here. Heck, even Antonio Banderas has a small part in this movie, and he does a good job as well. So, what about my negatives on the film? Well, we'll get into those now. My first negative, I'd have to say, is there's a bit too much CGI in the first half of the movie. It's kind of understandable in the opening sequences where you have the young Indiana Jones. That effect is good and not so good. For the most part, it looks great, but every now and then it looks a little bit rubbery, which is just kind of a flaw of that effect. We haven't really perfected it yet. And also, there's a bit too much CGI, the chase sequence where he's on the horse. But after that, the film actually kind of slows down and shows you a lot more practical effects, which is another positive of the film, I guess, is that there's a good bit of practical effects here. Another problem that I have with the film is that its pacing does slow down a little bit in the second act. I think you actually probably could cut out a good 15 minutes of the movie. I think a solid 15 minutes would make this thing flow a lot faster. There's just some scenes that drag on just a little bit too much, and that's only in the second act, really. It picks up pretty well in the third act of the film. First act is just a blast. And my last negative of the film, I'd have to say that it ends a bit abruptly. And what I mean by that is there is a conclusion, there is a finale, but then you expect maybe like a little bit more, like, okay, they're going to do this now, and then it just ends. It completely changes location, and then the movie ends. And you're like, wow, could have used another 5 minutes on that last scene there, but all right. But apart from that, there's really not many problems that I have with this film. I actually was rather impressed by it. I expected another Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, and people online have been kind of trashing this movie. And I thought, okay, well, maybe it's really flawed, but maybe I'll have some fun with it. But honestly, I found myself having a pretty damn good time. Overall, I'm going to give Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny an 8 out of 10. It's rather enjoyable. It has good action in it. The pacing is pretty good. The acting is good. The villain is likable. Not the best of the series, but definitely not the worst either. He's definitely an improvement over the villain from 4. And I'd even say an improvement over the villain from 3 as well. But all in all, it's an enjoyable film. I would recommend it. Not quite as good as the original trilogy, but, that is a high bar to set. But an enjoyable send-off to our hero. That may not be the popular opinion, but it is the one that I have. So without further ado, I guess I'd get into some spoilers, and that mostly comes into the last act. So if you don't want it to be spoiled, just skip to the very end of the video. I'll leave timestamps so you'll know when the spoilers end. The film essentially ends with Indy, Wombat, and Mads Mikkelsen, the villain, being transported back in time. They go back in time to 214 BC in Syracuse. It turns out the dial only goes to one moment in time. At least that's the way it's designed to do. It was essentially created by Archimedes so he could have help because his people were about to lose the war. So he created this dial to basically more or less change the outcome of the war. The funny thing is, the villain tried to use it to go back in time without knowing that it only went to one specific time. So it's like a very specific time travel device. It's actually really cool seeing into the movie with Indiana Jones seeing actual history in motion. That's how he explained it. It's like he never got to... These are things he studied his whole life, and now he gets to see it actually happen. It's a pretty awesome sequence, but the thing that I didn't like about it was after the villain's defeated, he more or less crashes his plane and dies. And Indiana, bleeding out because he's been shot early in the film, he wants to stay there and just die there, essentially, because he doesn't really have much to go back to in his own time. Because you actually find out early in the film that Mutt, from the fourth film, actually died in Vietnam. This is actually a sad scene. But he's knocked out by his goddaughter. Mind you, he is 80 years old and bleeding to death, so it's not really that unbelievable that she can knock him out. And he essentially wakes up back in his apartment where he reconciles with Marion, and they kind of have a scene that's reminiscent to the scene where they're on the boat in Raiders of the Lost Ark. It's a pretty awesome scene, and I did like that ending, but it's like, I kind of would have liked to have seen them have to fly back through the portal. I mean, we know that happened, because there's no other way they would have got back. But they don't show them go back. It's just like, oh yeah, he's back. It's like, okay, I get what happened. That's not really like a plot hole or anything, but maybe actually show them have to go back to the portal. Maybe they make it in the last second or something like that. It seems like a good cherry on top to the ending, but we don't really get that. I mean, the villain's defeated. The conflict's wrapped up. They've returned the dial, at least an earlier version of it, and they know not to mess with time again, but at the same time, it's like, well, don't you think you should have showed you having to escape Syracuse. And it's an interesting ending, but it just feels a little bit rushed. But apart from that, there's really no problem that I have with the ending. I just think that ending itself was a little bit rushed. All in all, I do enjoy the film, and I was actually impressed with it. Like I said, give it 8 out of 10, and I hope that the film will maybe have legs. It might lose money at the box office, but it doesn't really matter at this point. It's the last Indiana Jones film. All in all, I do recommend the film, and I hope that people can look past some of the internet hate and just see it for themselves. You might like it, and you might not, but don't be over reliant on the public opinion. And I'd say see it for yourself. You'll probably have a good time. I thank y'all for watching, and peace out.